Employers, when did you fire the problem employee and realize you made the biggest mistake? Story 1. I managed a mid-sized marketing agency and had an account manager named Kelly. She was sharp but had a habit of questioning everything. Client demands, campaign strategies, even my own directives. It came off as combative, and her coworkers complained she was slowing things down. A major client was unhappy about a delayed campaign, and I was fed up. I let her go, convinced she was the roadblock. 2 months later, that same client threatened to drop us entirely. I dug into the old project files and realized Kelly had been raising red flags about data inaccuracies from the client's own marketing department, the very thing now causing the mess. Without her, no one caught the errors in time. The client did leave, costing us a 6-figure account. Watching the panic ripple through my team, I realized Kelly wasn't a problem. She was our safeguard, and I'd removed it. Story 2. I worked in operations at a manufacturing plant. We had an older technician, Marvin, who was slow with new tech updates. Younger employees got frustrated having to explain software changes to him. One day, during a tight production schedule, Marvin accidentally miscalibrated a machine, causing a brief halt. My boss made a snap decision and fired him on the spot. At first, everyone thought it was the tough but right call. But 2 weeks later, one of the machines jammed completely, shutting down production for 2 days. Nobody could figure out the problem until a retired Marvin came in at a manager's desperate request. He fixed it in 45 minutes with a tool he had designed himself years earlier. Turned out that tool and his knowledge had been keeping us running for decades. We ended up rehiring him on a consulting contract at twice his previous salary. Story 3. At my previous job, we had a customer support rep named Sasha. She had the problem employee label because she refused to follow the scripts. She'd spend 20 minutes on a call that should have taken 5, and our metrics suffered. After multiple warnings, management decided to fire her. A month later, our customer satisfaction rating tanked. Complaints skyrocketed. I listened to her old call recordings. She was catching problems before they escalated, even helping customers fix unrelated issues. Those extra minutes saved the company from repeat calls and bad reviews. The new hires, trained to stick to the script, let problems slip by. By the time we realized the value of Sasha's approach, she'd already been hired by a competitor. Their satisfaction score went up exactly when ours plummeted. Story 4. I ran a restaurant and had a line cook, Jose, who constantly challenged menu changes. He'd say things like, "That dish won't work during a dinner rush," or "We'll waste too many ingredients this way." It annoyed my head chef, who saw it as insubordination. One night, after a heated argument over a new dish, the chef convinced me to fire Jose. For the next month, our food costs exploded, and prep times lagged badly. I eventually reviewed our ordering and inventory logs, and noticed Jose had been adjusting purchase orders on his own, saving us hundreds each week without telling anyone. He also had an informal prep system that cut cooking times in half. We ended up rewriting the entire kitchen workflow around his old methods, but he wouldn't come back. He'd opened his own food truck, and people were lining up down the street. Story 5. I used to work in IT management for a hospital. We had a network admin, Priya, who was notoriously blunt with doctors about their tech requests. She'd flat out refused to implement things she deemed unsafe or unnecessary. The medical staff complained constantly that she was rude and obstructive. After a major blow-up over a new scheduling system, upper management decided to let her go. Not even 3 weeks later, that system suffered a massive security breach. Patient data leaked, and the hospital faced legal trouble. It turned out Priya had been warning about vulnerabilities for months, but no one listened because she didn't sugarcoat things. I tried reaching out to her for help, but she'd already taken a job with a cybersecurity firm that paid double. Losing her didn't just cost us money, it cost us the trust of our patients. Story 6. I was the general manager of a high-end hotel, and we had a concierge named Thomas who, frankly, annoyed a lot of staff. He refused to use our standard guest interaction scripts, often comping small services without asking, and he had a habit of slipping out of his shift to handle things personally for VIP guests. Our finance director saw him as a liability and pushed me to let him go, arguing he cost us too much in freebies. 3 months later, our VIP repeat bookings dropped by almost 40%. Turns out, Thomas had a personal network of local business owners, restaurant managers, and entertainment organizers, all of whom gave him deals or priority access for our guests. Without him, our high-paying clientele started going elsewhere. The kicker, one of our former VIPs told me they now book exclusively at another hotel where Thomas works and where our ex-guests are spending thousands a month. Story 7. I managed a mid-size retail chain, and one store had a shift leader named Karen, who was infamous for micromanaging staff. Employees said she nitpicked everything, from folding techniques to where items were stocked. Morale dipped, and after several complaints, I decided to replace her with someone more relaxed. Within weeks, shrinkage numbers exploded. Theft was up, inventory was a mess, and customer complaints about out-of-stock items doubled. When I reviewed camera footage, I saw that Karen's nitpicking was actually her catching shoplifters in the act, reorganizing misplaced items before sales were lost, and ensuring high-demand stock was always visible. She had a memory like a steel trap, could recall exactly what was missing without looking at the system. I tried to get her back, but she'd already taken a district manager role with a competitor, and we were stuck cleaning up the chaos for months. Story 8. In a small software startup, we had a QA tester named Eli. He was quiet, kept to himself, and constantly delayed project launches because he found something. Developers complained he was overstepping and being too picky. We wanted to hit an aggressive deadline for a big investor demo, so when he pushed back yet again, we fired him for blocking progress. The app launched on time, and 2 weeks later, that same investor pulled out after a massive bug caused thousands of users' personal data to leak. We later found Eli's old notes. He had already documented that exact vulnerability and even had a fix planned. The day we fired him, he'd been drafting an email about it to me. By the time we reached out, he was working for a competitor who used his meticulous testing to win over our lost investor. Story 9. I ran a logistics company, and one dispatcher, Michelle, had a reputation for being too aggressive with drivers. She'd call them out if they were late, ask for proof when they claimed delays, and constantly reshuffled routes at the last second. The drivers complained so much that I let her go to restore harmony. The week after, late deliveries shot up, customer penalties rolled in, and one major client canceled a $2 million contract because a shipment was delayed by 2 days. That's when I learned Michelle wasn't just being difficult. She was actively monitoring weather patterns, traffic incidents, and even driver habits, adjusting routes in real time to avoid problems. Without her, nobody caught those delays early enough. The worst part? She had already joined a rival company, and within months, we were losing contracts to them because they were now far more reliable. Story 10. I worked in a research lab with a senior technician named Alex, who had been there for 20 years. He was gruff, resisted new equipment, and often clashed with younger scientists. Leadership saw him as a roadblock to innovation and decided to modernize by letting him go. 6 months later, a major experiment, one that was supposed to secure millions in grant funding, failed catastrophically. The younger staff couldn't figure out why the results were inconsistent. In desperation, I called Alex. He told me over the phone exactly which tiny calibration detail in the old equipment we'd overlooked. It was something never written down anywhere. He'd learned it through decades of trial and error. Without him, that knowledge was gone, and so was the funding. I still remember him saying, "I wasn't holding you back. I was holding you up." It stung because he was right. Story 11. I managed a chain of upscale bakeries, and our head pastry chef, Amira, had a reputation for being impossible to please. She'd send back trays of pastries for being slightly uneven, make the team redo decorations that looked fine to anyone else, and was notorious for rejecting supplier deliveries if they weren't up to her standards. Staff turnover was high in her kitchen, and I eventually gave in to the pressure to replace her with someone easier to work with. Within 2 months, our sales dropped nearly 30%. Regular customers started leaving reviews complaining that something tasted different or the magic was gone. Only then did I realize that Amira's obsession with perfection kept us ahead of competitors. Her personal supplier network brought in the freshest ingredients, and her meticulous quality checks meant every product was flawless. By the time I reached out to apologize, she was already running her own patisserie across town, with lines out the door every morning. Story 12. In my previous role as a call center manager for a financial services company, we had a senior agent named Marcus, who constantly challenged upper management's policies. He'd send long emails explaining why certain scripts were ineffective, or why certain processes frustrated customers. My boss saw him as a troublemaker who undermined authority, and I eventually had to fire him after he refused to use a new mandatory upselling script. 3 weeks later, our complaint rate skyrocketed, and account cancellations tripled. I dug into the calls and realized Marcus had been skipping the upsell because he knew it irritated customers, leading to fewer renewals. His approach, building trust instead of pushing sales, had quietly kept retention high. Ironically, the competitor he joined started advertising their low-pressure customer-first approach, which was basically Marcus's method. They doubled their customer base in 6 months, many of them former clients of ours. Story 13. I oversaw HR for a large nonprofit organization, and one of our grant writers, Elena, was notorious for being late to staff meetings and ignoring internal emails. Leadership complained she wasn't a team player and pushed for her termination. I finally agreed after yet another no-show at a quarterly meeting. 6 months later, we missed out on 3 major grants that would have funded critical programs. When I reviewed old files, I discovered Elena had been working those hours she missed meetings. She'd been personally visiting donors, attending community events, and networking with grant committees. Her unorthodox approach meant she had personal relationships with decision-makers, and losing her meant losing those connections. She wasn't ignoring us. She was out there winning us money. By then, she had joined another nonprofit that suddenly started receiving the very grants we used to secure with ease. Story 14. I worked as a director in a film production company, and our in-house editor, Julian, was considered the biggest bottleneck in the entire post-production process. He'd insist on multiple re-edits, color corrections, and audio tweaks even after clients had approved cuts. Producers complained that he was making projects late and over budget. Under pressure, I replaced him with a faster editor. At first, deadlines were met, but soon, our reputation tanked. Clients began complaining that the final cuts looked cheap or didn't have the same polish. What I hadn't realized was that Julian's obsessive re-editing was the reason our film stood out. His attention to subtle details gave our work a cinematic quality others couldn't match. Within a year, we'd lost 2 major contracts to a smaller studio. One Julian had joined, which was now winning awards using the same style he once gave us. Story 15. In a medical device manufacturing company, we had a compliance officer named Deepak, who was a nightmare during audits. He'd grill engineers, delay product launches over tiny documentation errors, and was famous for sending 3 a.m. emails pointing out regulatory risks. The CEO saw him as a killjoy who slowed innovation and ordered me to let him go. A year later, one of our flagship devices was recalled after failing an international compliance review, costing us millions and sparking a lawsuit. Reviewing old reports, I found Deepak had flagged the exact design flaw that caused the failure, twice, but was ignored because it wasn't urgent. His meticulous standards, which everyone hated, had kept us in the clear for years. When I tracked him down to ask for consulting help, he was already leading compliance for a competitor, the same competitor that took over our market share after our recall disaster. Story 16. I ran a mid-sized architectural firm, and we had a senior drafter named Lucas, who was notoriously stubborn about following the proper design review process. He'd refuse to send blueprints to clients until every detail had been checked against zoning codes and structural safety regulations, even if it meant missing proposed deadlines. This frustrated our lead architects, who saw him as slowing down projects. Under pressure from one major client, I replaced him with someone more flexible. Within 6 months, 2 of our projects were halted by city inspectors for compliance violations, costing us hundreds of thousands in redesign fees and lost contracts. I later learned Lucas had a personal relationship with several city officials, and they trusted his work so much that his plans often passed without additional scrutiny. Without him, every submission got the full audit treatment, and we paid the price in delays and fines. Story 17. At a high-end fashion boutique I managed, we had a floor associate named Naomi, who was infamous for hovering over customers. Several shoppers complained she was too intense, always suggesting items or rearranging displays while they browsed. After one too many bad reviews, I let her go to improve the customer experience. Sales plummeted almost instantly. Naomi hadn't just been hovering. She was an expert at reading body language, pulling the exact right item from the back, and closing high-ticket sales on the spot. Our regulars loved her because she remembered their sizes, styles, and even upcoming events. When I tried to win her back, she was already managing a luxury store down the street and taking our former top-spending customers with her. Story 18. I worked in a large agricultural supply company where one of our warehouse supervisors, Grant, was known for being too controlling. He demanded daily inventory checks, refused to let certain employees operate machinery without him present, and rejected supplier shipments if he saw the slightest flaw. Other managers thought he was paranoid. I finally fired him after a heated argument over delivery delays. 2 months later, a contaminated shipment slipped through without his watchful eye, leading to hundreds of farms getting faulty fertilizer that destroyed crops. The lawsuit nearly bankrupted us. Only then did I find out that Grant had single-handedly built a custom inspection protocol that had saved the company from similar disasters for years. The paranoia was actually experience, and without it, we were wide open to the mistake that ended up costing millions. Story 19. In a mid-level law firm, we had a paralegal named Teresa who was constantly butting heads with attorneys about case prep. She'd insist on double-checking citations, rereading old filings, and calling clients to confirm tiny details. Partners complained she wasted billable hours and micromanaged their work. The managing partner told me to replace her with someone faster. 3 months later, we lost a huge case because of an overlooked filing error, the exact kind of thing Teresa used to catch. It cost our client millions and damaged our reputation. A junior associate admitted that Teresa had saved them from similar mistakes dozens of times before. But no one liked how she slowed things down. I reached out to her, but she had already taken a position at a rival firm, which immediately started winning cases we were losing. Story 20. I once worked at a gourmet coffee roastery where our head roaster, Miguel, had a habit of halting production midday to adjust the profile. This drove our operations manager crazy because it threw off the schedule and sometimes caused late deliveries. After several complaints, I decided to replace him with a roaster who could stick to the plan. At first, things seemed fine. We were on time every day, until customers began noticing a drop in flavor quality. Some long-term clients canceled wholesale contracts, saying our coffee tasted flat. I later found out that Miguel was constantly adapting to subtle changes in bean moisture, ambient temperature, and humidity. Those midday pauses had been the secret to keeping our flavor profile consistent. Without him, every roast tasted slightly off. By the time I realized the mistake, Miguel had opened his own cafe, and half of our old customers were now buying from him. Story 21. I managed a busy urban construction company, and our site safety officer, Malik, was infamous for halting work over minor hazards. He'd stop an entire crew if he spotted a frayed rope, or made them redo scaffolding setup because a single brace was loose. Foreman complained he was wasting time and money, and after one high-pressure client meeting, I caved and replaced him with someone more efficient. 6 weeks later, one of our sites suffered a partial scaffold collapse that injured 3 workers and shut down the project for months. Investigators found the exact issue Malik had flagged in the past. His overcautious behavior had saved us from countless accidents before, but without him, we had no safety net. Literally. Story 22. I worked as a hotel operations director, and our housekeeping supervisor, Linda, was known for being unrelenting. She'd send staff back to re-clean rooms for things as small as a slightly streaky mirror or a pillow crease. Staff turnover in her department was high, and guest surveys sometimes mentioned she was a bit intense. Management decided her high standards weren't worth the drama and had me let her go. The following quarter, our TripAdvisor rating dropped by an entire star. Complaints about cleanliness doubled, and a major corporate client canceled their annual conference booking because standards had slipped. I learned Linda had a personal checklist of over 200 inspection points she'd memorized. She never missed a thing. Losing her meant losing the reputation we'd built for years. Story 23. In a regional newspaper office, we had a fact-checker named Oliver, who was considered a bottleneck in publishing. He'd hold back articles if even one source was questionable, and reporters accused him of paralyzing the newsroom with delays. During a breaking political scandal, he refused to approve a front-page story without further verification. Management fired him to keep the scoop moving. The story ran, and 2 days later, it was proven false. The retraction was humiliating. Advertisers pulled out, and our credibility tanked. Looking through Oliver's notes afterward, I saw he had already found inconsistencies and was just waiting on one last confirmation. His slow pace was the only thing that had kept us from printing garbage, and without him, we destroyed our own trustworthiness. Story 24. I used to run an events production company, and our logistics coordinator, Mariah, was a nightmare for creative staff. She constantly vetoed ambitious designs because of safety or load-bearing concerns, and she was notorious for triple-checking every rigging and lighting setup. The creative team pushed me to replace her with someone who understood the vision. At our first major event without her, a decorative structure partially collapsed during the opening night, luckily injuring no one, but terrifying guests and forcing an evacuation. Insurance investigations later revealed Mariah had personally modified rigging in past events to compensate for overlooked structural weaknesses. The creative flair we wanted had been possible only because she made it safe, and once she was gone, we lost both safety and credibility. Story 25. At a mid-tier software consulting firm, our lead analyst, Priyanka, had a habit of questioning client requirements in excruciating detail. Sales saw her as difficult because she made projects seem more complicated than they were. After a major client complained about her negativity, she was reassigned and then quietly let go. A year later, that same client sued us for breach of contract after the delivered product didn't match their actual needs. When I reviewed the archived project notes, I found Priyanka had spotted the exact mismatch and had been trying to get the client to clarify, but was overruled to keep them happy. Her relentless questioning wasn't negativity, it was risk prevention, and without her, we delivered a polished, useless product that cost us the client and hundreds of thousands in legal fees. Story 26. I managed a high-volume hospital kitchen, and our head dietitian, Clara, was infamous for being too controlling about patient meals. She'd personally review every tray for portion accuracy, double-check ingredients for dietary restrictions, and often hold up service until she was satisfied. Nurses complained patients were getting food late, and admin pushed me to replace her with someone faster. Within a month, we had a serious incident. A patient with a severe allergy was served the wrong meal, leading to an emergency transfer to the ICU. Clara's meticulous habits had prevented this exact scenario for years, but without her, mistakes slipped through. The worst part? We later found out she had her own cross-referencing system that caught kitchen errors before they reached patients. That system was never written down, so it left with her. Story 27. At a regional airport, we had a ground operations supervisor named Frank, who was known for constantly slowing things down. He insisted on extra safety checks for every departure, even if it meant delaying flights by a few minutes. Pilots and airline reps hated the holdups and pushed to have him reassigned. After one particularly heated incident with a captain, I let him go. A few weeks later, a minor mechanical fault in an aircraft went unnoticed during the faster checks, forcing an emergency landing. Thankfully, no one was hurt, but the media coverage was brutal. Later, an engineer told me Frank had a reputation in the industry for catching problems everyone else missed, and that his extra checks were unofficially credited with preventing several dangerous situations in the past. We lost a safety record we'd proudly kept for decades. Story 28. I ran a mid-sized publishing house, and our senior proofreader, Lydia, was notorious for taking forever on manuscripts. She'd reject pages for a single misplaced comma or ask authors to rephrase entire sections for clarity. Editors called her the bottleneck and claimed she was driving authors away. I finally gave in and let her go to streamline operations. Within months, multiple books went to print with embarrassing typos, factual errors, and even a misattributed quote that caused a PR nightmare. We had to recall an entire print run, costing us hundreds of thousands. Lydia's perfectionism had been our invisible safety net. She caught legal liabilities and inconsistencies no one else even noticed. By the time I tried to rehire her, she'd launched her own freelance service, and half our former authors had followed her there. Story 29. In a large electronics repair company, our senior technician, Omar, was seen as too old school. He refused to skip diagnostic steps, even on routine jobs, and often argued with management about unrealistic repair timelines. After a few high-profile delays, the CEO told me to replace him. The following quarter, warranty claims spiked because rushed repairs kept failing. One failure even caused a small electrical fire in a customer's home, prompting a costly lawsuit. I found out Omar's extra diagnostic work identified hidden damage that standard procedures didn't cover, work that prevented future breakdowns. His knowledge wasn't in any manual. It came from decades of hands-on experience. Losing him meant losing that invisible layer of quality control, and it nearly destroyed our reputation. Story 30. I worked for a municipal water treatment facility, and our senior water quality inspector, Janet, was famous for being overly cautious. She'd order extra testing, shut down pumps for minor irregularities, and constantly clash with budget managers over unnecessary lab work. Eventually, leadership decided she was wasting money and asked me to terminate her. 3 months later, a contamination incident hit the local news when trace chemicals were found in the water supply. The resulting public panic and government investigation cost millions in remediation. Reviewing her old reports, I saw Janet had documented early warning signs of the exact issue, but those tests were cut to save costs after she left. Her diligence had been quietly preventing disaster for years, but nobody realized it until the damage was already done. Story 31. I managed a mid-sized urban transit company, and our senior route planner, Dennis, was notorious for pushing back against schedule changes. He'd argue for days over minor adjustments, insisting they'd cause service bottlenecks or knock-on delays. Operations hated working with him because he refused to approve efficiency tweaks. Eventually, we replaced him with someone willing to implement faster routes. At first, it looked like we'd shaved minutes off commute times, until complaints rolled in about missed connections, overcrowding, and buses arriving late by half an hour. Revenue from commuter passes dropped sharply. It turned out Dennis had mapped the city's peak hour traffic patterns so precisely that his routes balanced efficiency with reliability. His stubbornness wasn't obstruction. It was the reason our system ran smoothly. By the time I realized it, he'd been hired by another transit authority, one now boasting record reliability in their press releases. Story 32. In a large marine shipping company, we had a port logistics manager named Sophia who was labeled too rigid by captains and crew. She would delay cargo loading for weather checks, even in seemingly calm conditions, and would reject certain dock positions if tides weren't ideal. After pressure from upper management to speed up port operations, I let her go. 2 months later, a massive shipment shifted during transport due to rough seas, damaging millions in goods and leading to a costly insurance claim. When the report came back, it stated Sophia's meticulous loading procedures had historically prevented exactly this kind of disaster. Her so-called rigidity had been our shield against risk. Without her, we'd gambled with safety and lost. Story 33. I worked in a biotech research facility where our senior lab coordinator, Martin, was seen as a roadblock to innovation. He insisted on triple-checking chemical storage, personally overseeing hazardous material disposal, and requiring strict sign-off before any experiment began. Scientists complained he slowed projects to a crawl. After a major investor visit, management decided his caution was bad optics and removed him. Not even 2 months later, a lab mishandled a volatile compound, triggering a small explosion that injured 2 staff members and shut the facility down for weeks. Reviewing incident logs, I saw Martin had flagged improper storage procedures in that same lab 3 times before being dismissed. He wasn't blocking progress, he was keeping us alive. Story 34. At a major art museum, our senior conservator, Elise, was considered too picky about display conditions. She constantly ordered adjustments to lighting, humidity, and temperature, often delaying exhibit openings. Donors and curators grumbled about her demands, claiming she was overreacting. Eventually, the board voted to replace her with someone more accommodating. 6 months later, a priceless 17th century painting developed visible damage from micro-cracking. Irreversible, according to restoration experts. Elise's strict environmental controls had protected delicate works for decades. Losing her meant losing that institutional knowledge, and the museum quietly spent hundreds of thousands on emergency conservation efforts. The painting, however, will never fully recover. Story 35. I oversaw operations at a national food distribution company, and our cold storage supervisor, Greg, was infamous for obsessing over refrigeration unit readings. He'd halt shipments if a single sensor showed a 1-degree variance and refused to load trucks until temperatures were stable. Dispatchers thought he was impossible to work with. After one too many delays, we replaced him. The first summer without Greg, a large shipment of dairy products spoiled during transit, costing us a major grocery chain contract. An internal review revealed Greg had been tracking subtle equipment patterns and weather forecasts to predict failures before they happened. Without his interventions, the margin for error disappeared, and so did one of our biggest clients. Story 36. I ran a large private school, and our head of maintenance, Robert, was infamous for being overly dramatic about building repairs. He'd shut down classrooms for minor leaks, delay events over possible electrical issues, and constantly submit long lists of urgent repairs. Teachers and parents complained he was disrupting operations. Under pressure, I replaced him with someone more flexible. Within a semester, a water pipe burst above a computer lab, destroying thousands of dollars in equipment and forcing us to cancel classes for a week. The repair company later confirmed Robert had flagged that exact pipe as a high risk months earlier, but no one acted after he left. His overreacting had been the difference between prevention and disaster. Story 37. I worked for a large online retail company, and our fraud prevention lead, Aisha, was known for flagging too many transactions. Sales complained she slowed revenue by over-scrutinizing orders. Eventually, leadership decided her caution was hurting growth and moved her out. Within 2 months, we were hit with a coordinated fraud attack that cost the company over $4 million in chargebacks and legal fees. A later investigation revealed Aisha had identified the network behind the fraud months earlier and had built manual filters to catch them. Filters that were removed after she left. The executives who pushed her out admitted privately that firing her had been the single most expensive decision they'd ever made. Story 38. In a high-end landscaping company, we had a project manager named Miguel who constantly fought with clients about their design choices. He'd insist certain plant arrangements wouldn't survive local weather, or that certain stonework would crack within years. Clients thought he was being difficult, and after one particularly heated meeting, I replaced him with someone who focused on customer satisfaction. A year later, several high-value projects failed. Expensive plants died, retaining walls collapsed, and clients demanded refunds. Miguel's designs had been functional for the long term, not just beautiful for the reveal. Without him, we built projects that looked great in the short term but couldn't withstand reality. Our reputation, once the best in the region, was shredded in a single season. Story 39. I managed a pharmaceutical packaging facility, and our quality control lead, Hannah, was notorious for rejecting batches over minor labeling issues. Production crews hated her for slowing things down, and upper management eventually sided with them to hit output goals. The first quarter without her, an entire shipment went out with incorrect dosage instructions on the label. The recall was immediate and cost us millions, not to mention the public trust damage. I later learned Hannah had developed a system of visual cues to catch label misprints that machines missed. Her so-called overly critical nature had been the last line of defense between us and a regulatory nightmare. Story 40. In a television broadcasting company, our chief sound engineer, Victor, was considered too fussy about audio checks. He'd delay live shows to fix small feedback noises or mic placement issues that most people couldn't hear. Producers complained constantly, and after one big sponsor grumbled about delays, Victor was let go. The next live event without him suffered a catastrophic audio failure. Mics cut out mid-performance, static buzz filled the feed, and the broadcast was unwatchable. Sponsors demanded refunds, and social media tore us apart. Reviewing the setup logs, I saw Victor had personally modified equipment and created backup systems that no one else knew how to use. We'd removed the one person who could guarantee flawless live audio, and the cost was both financial and reputational. Story 41. I managed a chain of busy supermarkets, and our produce manager, Ellen, was known for being too picky with supplier deliveries. She'd reject entire pallets of fruit if they didn't meet her standards, sometimes sending suppliers away twice in a week. Other managers complained about empty shelves and frustrated customers, so I replaced her with someone more lenient. Within a month, complaints about rotten produce skyrocketed. Regulars stopped shopping with us after finding moldy strawberries and bruised apples. Sales in the produce department dropped by nearly half, which dragged down the entire store's revenue. Only then did I learn Ellen had long-standing relationships with select farmers and could negotiate better replacements within hours. Without her, we were stuck accepting subpar shipments and paying the price in customer trust. Story 42. I worked in a mid-sized aerospace manufacturing company, and our senior machinist, Raj, was viewed as too slow for modern production. He insisted on calibrating equipment multiple times a day and refused to cut corners even under tight deadlines. After a particularly heated meeting about output quotas, management decided to retire him early. 2 months later, a batch of precision components failed during a critical stress test for a major client. The failure delayed a multi-million-dollar project and risked our contract. Digging into the cause, I found out Raj's repeated calibrations were preventing exactly this type of tolerance error. His slowness was the only thing keeping our production within perfect spec. Story 43. In a corporate law firm, we had a contract specialist named Denise, who was famous for combing through agreements for tiny inconsistencies. Partners saw her as a bottleneck who stalled deal signings with endless revisions. A big client grew impatient, and I let her go to keep the deal moving. 3 months later, that same client sued us after discovering a clause in the contract that allowed the other party to terminate without penalty, a clause Denise had already flagged before being dismissed. Losing her didn't just cost us the client. It cost us a public case that damaged our firm's credibility for years. Story 44. I managed a high-end catering business, and our head event coordinator, Fiona, had a reputation for being overly controlling. She'd insist on visiting venues multiple times before events, rechecking seating charts, and personally tasting every menu item before approval. Staff saw her as exhausting to work with, and I eventually replaced her to boost morale. Our first big wedding without her ended in disaster. The venue had a hidden ventilation issue that made the ballroom sweltering. The seating layout blocked servers, and a fish entree arrived spoiled. Fiona's obsessive pre-event inspections had prevented these problems for years, but without her, we walked straight into them. The couple demanded a full refund, and word spread fast enough to cost us several future bookings. Story 45. I ran IT for a large financial institution, and our cybersecurity analyst, Marcus, was known for overcomplicating projects. He'd delay software rollouts to run extra penetration tests and constantly argued with developers about security holes no one else could see. Management wanted faster delivery times, so I reluctantly let him go. 6 weeks later, our new online platform was hacked, exposing thousands of client accounts. The breach led to regulatory fines, lawsuits, and a PR nightmare. Reviewing old security tickets, I found Marcus had already documented the exact vulnerability the hackers exploited. He'd been trying to fix it before launch, but we pushed him out for being too cautious. The irony was brutal. His caution could have saved us millions. Story 46. I managed a chain of large gyms, and our head equipment technician, Leo, was known for being too obsessive about maintenance. He'd shut down machines for hours to check internal components, swap out parts before they failed, and log every adjustment in painstaking detail. Trainers and members complained about the downtime, and I finally replaced him with someone who could keep more machines available. Within a month, 3 treadmills malfunctioned mid-use. One injury resulted in a lawsuit. When the new tech opened up the machines, he found multiple worn parts Leo had already flagged for replacement. His preemptive work had been keeping everything safe, but without him, we were running on borrowed time. Story 47. At a mid-tier animation studio, we had a lead storyboard artist named Kara, who was famous for reworking entire sequences to fix pacing or continuity issues. Directors saw her as slowing down projects and going beyond her role. When we got a big contract with a streaming platform, the producer demanded faster turnaround, and Kara was let go. The final season of that show became a disaster. Viewers complained about inconsistent storylines, and critics tore apart the editing. We lost our renewal deal, and I later saw Kara's old boards for those exact episodes. She'd mapped out fixes for the plot holes everyone later mocked us for. Her slow approach was the glue that held stories together. Story 48. I ran a mid-sized shipping logistics firm, and our customs compliance officer, Hugo, had a habit of holding up shipments for extra paperwork. Sales hated him because it meant delayed deliveries and angry customers. After a major account complained, I replaced him with someone more business-friendly. 2 months later, a large shipment was seized at the border due to incomplete documentation, costing us hundreds of thousands in goods and penalties. Reviewing Hugo's old files, I found he'd built personal relationships with customs agents and knew exactly how to pre-clear high-risk shipments. His caution wasn't bureaucracy. It was the reason our goods always moved through without trouble. Story 49. In a major hotel chain, our front desk manager, Sheila, had a reputation for being overly strict with booking policies. She wouldn't bend rules for VIPs, insisted on double-checking payment methods, and made staff follow identity verification procedures to the letter. Upper management thought she was too inflexible for the luxury market and replaced her. Within weeks, we had multiple incidents of credit card fraud, chargebacks, and even a situation where someone booked under a fake name to host an illegal event. Sheila's rigidity had been protecting the hotel from exactly these issues, and without her, we were wide open to them. Story 50. I worked in a major pharmaceutical lab, and our senior research archivist, Lillian, was notorious for refusing to discard outdated experimental data. Scientists thought she was wasting storage and making it harder to find current information. After one too many complaints about her hoarding, management let her go. Months later, a new drug candidate failed mid-trial due to an unexpected interaction. An interaction that had been recorded in a 15-year-old dataset Lillian had preserved. That file was deleted after she left to free up space. Without that historical data, we'd unknowingly repeated an old mistake, costing us millions and years of work. Lillian wasn't clinging to the past. She was guarding the knowledge that kept us from walking into the same traps. Story 51. I managed a large commercial bakery that supplied bread to dozens of grocery stores. Our head night baker, Salvatore, was known for wasting time by testing each new flour delivery before production. He'd adjust recipes slightly depending on moisture and grind. Changes most people thought were pointless. Management wanted faster output, so I replaced him with someone who would just follow the recipe. Within 2 weeks, customers were complaining the bread was inconsistent, sometimes too dense or crumbly. A major supermarket chain pulled our contract after a bad batch. I later found out Salvatore's adjustments were the only reason our bread stayed perfectly consistent across different suppliers. Without him, we were delivering whatever came out of the oven and losing business fast. Story 52. I worked for a national rail company, and our lead track inspector, Carl, had a reputation for being too thorough. He'd stop train traffic to recheck sections of rail, sometimes delaying schedules by hours. Passengers complained, and higher-ups were tired of the lost revenue from delays. They replaced him with someone quicker. 2 months later, a freight train derailed on a section Carl had been monitoring, spilling hazardous materials and shutting down the line for weeks. The investigation found that Carl's repeated checks had been keeping a small crack in the rail under control before it worsened. Without his vigilance, the crack grew until it caused a disaster. Story 53. In a luxury jewelry store, our head gemologist, Renee, was considered too slow because she insisted on verifying every gemstone with advanced testing before putting it on display. Sales associates complained she delayed product launches, and management replaced her with someone who could move inventory faster. Within a month, a client returned a high-value diamond after having it appraised elsewhere. It turned out to be a treated stone worth far less than advertised. Word spread, and our reputation tanked. Later, I discovered Renee's careful verifications had been catching supplier mistakes, and in some cases, outright fraud. Losing her meant we were selling whatever we were sent, no matter the quality. Story 54. I managed a large farming cooperative, and our irrigation system supervisor, Thomas, had a habit of halting water flow to entire fields if he detected even small inconsistencies in pressure. Farmers complained he was overreacting and costing them growth time, so the board decided to replace him. That summer, a main irrigation line burst, flooding and destroying acres of crops. It turned out Thomas had been monitoring tiny fluctuations that signaled the line's wear long before anyone else noticed. His so-called overreaction had been the reason we'd gone years without a major irrigation failure. Story 55. In a busy metropolitan hospital, our senior scheduling coordinator, Janet, was notorious for refusing to overbook surgeries, even when doctors insisted they could handle more. Administrators thought she was wasting operating room capacity and replaced her with someone more flexible. Within weeks, surgeries were running over time. Patients were left waiting hours under anesthesia, and one high-profile patient's procedure was canceled last minute due to a room still being in use. Janet had built her schedules with buffers for emergencies and complications, which no one else understood until it was too late. That safety margin had kept the hospital running smoothly, and we didn't realize it until chaos set in. Story 56. I ran a high-end furniture manufacturing business, and our senior woodworker, Patrick, was seen as too old-fashioned. He insisted on inspecting every shipment of lumber, rejecting pieces with knots, hairline cracks, or warping. Production managers said he was slowing things down and creating waste. I eventually replaced him with someone who would use what we have. Within 2 months, multiple high-value custom orders were returned because tabletops warped or split after delivery. The replacements cost us thousands and strained relationships with luxury clients. Patrick's pickiness wasn't vanity. It was the quality control that had built our reputation over decades. Without him, the defects went straight into customers' homes. Story 57. I worked in a busy urban fire department's logistics division, and our equipment manager, Rosa, was known for obsessively checking every piece of gear after use. She'd delay training drills or inspections if even one hose or breathing apparatus needed extra cleaning or a part swap. Some officers saw her as overbearing, and the chief replaced her to streamline operations. 2 months later, during a real fire response, a breathing mask failed mid-operation because of a small, previously undetected crack. The incident forced a firefighter's evacuation from the building and nearly cost him his life. Rosa's diligence had been the invisible barrier preventing gear failures, but we didn't appreciate it until the stakes were deadly. Story 58. In a financial auditing firm, we had a senior auditor named Charles who was infamous for challenging client numbers far beyond the project scope. He'd ask for old statements, compare data across multiple years, and make clients uneasy with his persistence. Partners said he was driving away business and let him go. 6 months later, one of our largest clients collapsed in a fraud scandal, and regulators discovered our firm had signed off on years of falsified reports. Digging through old files, I found Charles had already flagged the inconsistencies and was in the middle of compiling evidence before he was fired. His relentless digging could have saved the firm's reputation. Instead, it ended up costing us millions in fines and losing most of our client base. Story 59. I managed a cruise line's onboard entertainment division, and our stage technician, Andre, had a reputation for being too paranoid about rigging checks. He would delay rehearsals to test every harness, pulley, and backdrop twice before shows. Performers complained constantly, and the cruise director finally replaced him with someone who worked faster. A month later, during a live acrobatic performance, a rigging point failed, causing a dangerous mid-air fall. Thankfully, no one died, but the incident made headlines and caused multiple lawsuits. Reviewing Andre's records, I found he'd flagged that exact rigging point as due for replacement weeks earlier. His caution had been the silent reason our shows had gone incident-free for years. Story 60. In a national chain of veterinary clinics, our lead vet tech, Emily, was notorious for rejecting certain suppliers' medications if they didn't meet her standards, even if they were cheaper and widely used. Management saw it as being difficult and slowing procurement, so she was replaced. Within a few months, we started seeing a spike in allergic reactions among pets after treatments. An investigation revealed that the cheaper supplier's meds contained a compound that wasn't listed on the label but triggered reactions in sensitive animals. Emily had identified the risk years ago through her own independent testing. Her stubborn refusal to compromise on quality had been quietly preventing harm, and without her, our patients paid the price. Story 61. I managed a national chain of cold storage warehouses, and our senior refrigeration engineer, Victor, was famous for overcomplicating repairs. He'd take equipment offline for hours to replace small parts that hadn't even failed yet, driving operations crazy. After one too many complaints about delays, we replaced him with someone who could keep things running. 3 months later, one of our largest freezers failed over a weekend, ruining millions in perishable goods and breaching multiple contracts. The post-mortem showed Victor had predicted the failure exactly, down to the part number, and had been preparing to swap it before his dismissal. His preventative maintenance wasn't slowing us down. It was the only thing keeping disaster away. Story 62. I worked for a luxury watch manufacturer, and our lead quality inspector, Helena, was notorious for rejecting pieces for imperfections no one else could see. She'd hold up shipments for days while watches went through another round of polishing or adjustments. Management argued her standards were too extreme and replaced her to speed up production. Within months, our reputation among collectors tanked after photos of misaligned dials and uneven bezels circulated online. Orders from 2 major international retailers were canceled. I later learned Helena could spot flaws invisible to the naked eye but obvious under magnification. Exactly how high-end buyers examine their purchases. Losing her meant losing the flawless reputation we'd built for decades.